SpaceSec workshop we did for the first time this year. My name is Martin Strohmeyer. I work at Swiss and Cyber Defense Campus in Switzerland, based in Zurich.
And my name is Johannes Wilbold. I'm at the Ruhr University Bochum, and I'm a PhD student there.
All right. So let's
So let me give some numbers about the workshop. It's the very first workshop, the very first academic workshop, and on the security of space and satellite systems. So we had it the first time here, and it was a half-day workshop yesterday. So unfortunately, if you haven't been there, you already missed it. Sorry. We got a total of 19 submissions, which we think is pretty good for a very first-time workshop. We were only able to accept 10 of the papers since we didn't have much more time in the workshop itself. And generally, we got around 3 to 4 reviews per paper, which was an amazing job by our program committee, since we didn't have as many people, since we didn't expect so many submissions. We had a pretty full room. Honestly, most of the chairs were used. We had around 60 people, I would assume. I didn't count, but I guess that's how many people fit in the room. Also, we had around 15 participants virtually over the event, so around 75 people overall. We will have workshop proceedings only after the conference, since our workshop was only accepted for NDSS at around, I guess, end of October, start of November. So the time frame to actually submit something was rather short, and as any workshop, we extended our deadline to submit papers. And you will see the workshop proceedings around mid of March. If you're already interested in the papers, feel free to join the workshop minus SpaceSec channel in Slack. There we have a Dropbox link, and there are all the preprint versions of the papers already, also most of the talks.
Yeah, so give you some slight overview of how it went yesterday. We really aim for a traditional workshop format, right? So discussions, everyone in the room should be involved. We left enough time, 8 to 10 minutes for every paper, really for in-depth discussions between the presenters, but also among the people in the room. That was our goal, because we really wanted, to keep that atmosphere and not just present papers. We had different types of papers, as we've seen in other workshops, research papers, of course, but also work in progress and position papers, because we wanted to really, and kick this off as a workshop and see whether there's really interest and what are the interests of the community. One of the goals we had was also to merge two worlds. There, on the one hand, you have this traditionally very inaccessible area of people who build space systems, rockets, satellites, in very large aerospace institutions. Often defense contractors, very closed, right? They are not known to be very open and talk to academic researchers at universities. So that was one of the common themes. The university researchers say, okay, how do we get access to all these systems, right? It's expensive, it's not accessible, it's proprietary, there are NDAs. That was definitely one of the things that was being discussed. So we wanted to create some sort of community where it's maybe possible to have some access and, know each other and have some trust. We had 4 different sessions with some papers and 1 keynote. So we're going to quickly recap that. First of all, we had a really amazing keynote by James Brewer, works at the Directorate for Digital Services, or part of the American DoD. He is really, I would say, credited for reinvigorating that field in space or in system security research. In his PhD, he wrote several papers at Oakland, at NDSS. It was really a kickstart for some of most creative research in space in this area. So he let us know what, if you kind of were to do a PhD again at this time, what are areas that are interesting that should be looked at by researchers? Important point in that, I can't obviously recap the whole keynote, but the slides are also available on the Slack, was to figure out what's really different between, space and the ground. His arguments were, okay, space is very weird. I mean, there's a vacuum. It's really long distances. It's relevant for a lot of network research, of course. You have a lot of tech that needs to be very resilient against things that you don't have on Earth, radiation, temperatures, everything, right? So the tech adapts, needs to be very robust against that, but maybe not against, or not good for security. Security practices are not great because you have to adapt all these robust systems, and they often float in space for decades, right? So it's very easy to imagine how that's a problem for security. And from there, a lot of potential research into cybersecurity in space also flows. What did we use? Yeah. The first session that we had was really, okay, let's threat model space. We had 2 talks on that. People just make the same argument that basically James made in the keynote, saying, okay, we have a lot of attacks on, say, sensor systems. A lot of things we saw, for example, also in SpaceSec, right? Cars, everything has sensors. And it's a popular pastime at NDSS and other system security conferences to attack these sensors. But can you do it in space, right? And how can you do it? That's definitely an interesting threat modeling exercise.
All right, our next our next session was also the largest session. It was about link segment security. So the link segment in space is basically the connection between any orbital and ground-based assets. With one interesting paper called Firefly, where they looked into how you could, for example, exploit ground stations via introducing malicious traffic into the ground stations. So, for example, there is a NASA NASA program where they monitor wildfires via satellite, and they introduce malicious data so that there is an NDSS wildfire somewhere in the world. Obviously, this wasn't there in reality. There was also one interesting talk where they captured a lot of satellite traffic and found out it's actually pretty hard to pass since there are a lot of errors in there. So they used a machine learning model to do protocol parsing. One of the more already deep space topic was a talk on interplanetary internet. So there's actually quite some work done on this already. And somebody proposed security measures or looked into the security parts of the interplanetary internet. So you have, for example, groups of assets like rovers on Mars. They alone can communicate back to Earth, for example, in this case, and will, for example, relay their communication to some Mars orbital station that then relays it to Earth. And how can you ensure security in such cases? We also had a pretty interesting attack on how you could, for example, perform denial of service on these new big constellations like Starlink and OneWeb. So, for example, if you have a lot of satellites and you want to spoof ground stations, how can you do that? We also had one part on space segment security. So space segment is really the stuff that is up in space. So, for example, satellites. We had one interesting talk about this firmware security running on these systems. So they used a fuzzer to find some bugs in these systems, and also evaluated how these bugs came to be. For example, there's a lot of legacy code, like these systems grow over years or even decades. So bugs also accumulate. And since security researchers rarely look into these things, it's pretty interesting to see what is in there. We also had one talk that thought about what happens to all these satellites that are up there for a few decades already, and what is after the end of life mission. So they're, for example, 25 years dead in orbit before they re-enter into the Earth atmosphere. And there will be actually thousands of these satellites in the next years or next decades. So maybe we should think about how you secure an asset that nobody's using, but that still could do harm in the environment.
Yes, and the final session basically, loops around to the beginning. How can we test some of these things? A lot of the attacks were ideas, or looked at the software we get, but how can we test satellites? How can we test the communication? So several people tried to build test beds to test out attacks against communication or on satellites wirelessly, or software testing in the real world. So with both one testbed looking at QPAP, which was presented at NDSS 2021, but the paper only had simulations. So this paper put it into practice and tried it with the real world satellite setup. And the other testbed also something possible to use for other researchers. Looked at flatbed satellites, but also try to have a unified testbed, including drones, aviation, and other protocols that are related and often also go over satellites. Right.
Yeah, that's it from our part.
That's it from us. Maybe we had a lot of input, so hopefully next year, if the NDSS chairs lets us, or the next workshop chair, the workshop chair or chair. Okay, then maybe we can come back for a full day workshop. But we at least had a very good interest for this on this short notice, so we're quite happy with that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.